Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is already the 10th of January, and wow, I really have horrible luck when it comes to the upload schedule of my videos because I am now back after a full week of just action packed developments. There's so much to unpack in today's video. We're going to begin by looking at Andriivka and Pokrovsk. We'll then look at the really important Russian advances into northern Toretsk, reaching the northern outer ring of the city, as well as the Ukrainian attack in the Kursk region, along with the concurrent Russian attacks that occurred in very similar locations starting on January 5th, stretching all the way up to today. So we're going to go through all of that. There are some really important troop rotations as well that will be discussed as we move from front to front. But we're going to zoom in and begin by looking at the Dakhnia pocket, as I now refer to it as. And you can see over here that the Russians are very close to actually entering into the village proper. They're about 800 meters away. The only thing separating the Russians is this highway over here, which the Russians need to advance through a little more. They need to pass through these just agricultural facilities and generally gardening regions. But they've been able to take recently 3.4 square kilometers of territory in the western edge of the industrial zone. You can see your geolocations from the Molot's FPV group. It is an FPV group that was previously stationed in the Kharkiv sector, attached, I think, to the 65th Mechanized Brigade or one of the adjacent units. And now it's been redirected to here to just give additional supports to the Ukrainian group of forces. And as you zoom out, you can see that there is a large hodgepodge of Ukrainian forces that have just constantly been backtracking in various locations, whether it be the Uspennivka pockets, the area around Dalnya, Kurkova itself, and now they're just all sort of coalescing around this one final pocket that runs from the line of contact around Dakhnia to the western approaches, reaching areas like Ulakli, Andriivka, Kostyantynivka. And so now the Ukrainians over these past couple of weeks have been in the process of trying to reform their defensive structure and to reestablish means of communication between units and try to create a very strong perimeter to hold back against any sort of Russian undermining of their flanks and any sort of additional really large scale and fast paced failures and closures of certain locations of fighting, as we saw in areas in Kurkova, especially in the western parts of that town and in Uspennivka pockets over a month ago now. And so just to go back a bit to the north, the Russians have shifted a lot of their focus and intensity towards the Petropavlivka area and have taken over the entirety of the village. This happened a couple of days ago, January 4th, the 114th Brigade. They've been really active a bit to the south. They were monumental in taking over Kurkova and then were immediately redirected to the Sontsivka region and played a role in taking Petropavlivka. They may have also taken Slavyanka, so I need to just double check that. But they are now involved with very important captures of territory on the northern flank of Andriivka, which now allows the Russian forces to have a direct line of attack towards this highway that connects Andriivka to Pokrovsk. It's only about 4 kilometers away from the line of contact. And from there is no prepared village. There's no settlement that the Ukrainians can fall back on before reaching Andriivka itself. The only thing separating the Russians from Andriivka, but the point that they would be at in the scenario they reach the highway, would be the extensive fortifications built north of the town. But that would be about it. There would be no other depth. And you could look over here, Shevchenko as well. The Russians have taken it over in its entirety, and I'm being pretty conservative with my estimates of where the line of contact is, because others would say that the Russians have also taken over all of the hinterlands, including the tree lines and the strongholds in between Petropavlivka and Shevchenko. And that would, again, further improve the local Russian standing, eliminate some of the potential locations where the Ukrainians could drag out the fighting, and then give the Russians further axes and further opportunities to launch attacks towards the Ukrainian holdings that are very, very important to preserve in the center of Andriivka. So that's something that is important to look at, but it has taken a bit of a backseat, not necessarily entirely a backseat, but there have been some movements of forces away from the Kurkova area by the Russian side. And in turn, the Russians have begun to redeploy units to this part of the front line, the Kurkova area, and now Andriivka front, that previously were on the sidelines, that had a couple of weeks or months of just sort of operational rest. So just a good example of that would be the 255th Motor Rifle Regiment. They were pretty big around the time period of Maximilianivka, Herivka, even Marinka, and they just sort of fell into irrelevancy. They weren't mentioned as much during the entire climax of the battles in Uspanivka and Kurakove. Now it appears that they're being reintroduced and that they're going to have a more active role as some of the core Russian units involved with the capture in some of these battles are being moved elsewhere or are just seeing a bit of a rest period. You also have the 102nd Motorized Rifle Regiment included within that category. And just to go a bit to the north, you'll see this in a second, but the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the main units involved in the capture of Kurakove and other villages, has already been redeployed northwards and is engaged in fighting not even over here, but even further to the north in Vodvizhenko. So we're going to get to that a bit later on in the video. I'm going to zoom in over here and show you guys that the Russians have reached the eastern outskirts of Yasnove. So this comes from an attack along the highway from Novo-Olenivka, and then they cross past Kranko. So on January 8th, you just had Ukrainian FPVs hitting Russian soldiers as they were making that initial approach. But so far, there's not any evidence of the Russians occupying the village or even entering it in earnest. Once they do enter and they get a foothold, that's when it becomes very difficult to push them out, given the small surface area of the village. Here, a bit in the north, the Russians have been able to solidify control of territory between Vovkove and Solone. This amounts to 1.6 square kilometers of territory captured. You can see here that the Birds of Magyar, they released a really long compilation. I think it's 13 minutes long, just of them picking off individual Russian soldiers, largely in open fields, but also in tree lines and trenches. And some of that has been geolocated to this span of territory over here, where Russian forces really tried to assert themselves along this road and even further to the northwest. And in turn, in a lot of cases, they get spotted by the Ukrainian drone crews in the open, and they get targeted, of course. So that's an indication of casualties, but also of Russian presence in these regions. A bit to the north of Vovkove, the Russians advanced 0.8 square kilometers. And here you can see just January 6th, the Ukrainians, they dropped grenades onto the Russian holdings along this particular line of trenches, indicating a Russian advance that is very close to the T0406 highway. It's only 1.2 kilometers away. That highway, as a reminder, it connects the entire sort of Dnipro network of logistics, which starts in the city of Dnipro and then runs through the entire oblast, connects to the sort of intermediary cities like Mezhova, and then from there to Pokrovsk itself. So it is very important when it comes to supply. It's not the only major artery coming from Dnipro, because you have a bit to the north the E50 highway, but it is still a really important area for increasing the volume of movement back and forth from the city on a daily basis. And now it is under intense bombardment. It is very, very close to actual physical fighting due to the Russians being so close to Pokrovsk. In many of these locations, you could just see, as an example, here the Russians are only about 2.5 kilometers away from the Shakhtarsky district and about 5 kilometers or 4.5 kilometers away from the heart of the city. They're moving D-30 howitzers very close, placing them on local heights and firing them into the center of Pokrovsk as an example. That's something that's beginning to happen. You also have fiber optic FPVs being utilized in this region for the first time. So, for a while, Russians were only deploying them in the Kursk region, and we're going to look at that more in detail as the video goes on. But over time, the production has increased, and now it's been moved to Ukraine proper, and it's starting off its deployment in areas that are most critical to the front line, which would include the Pokrovsk region. And so now Russian units are beginning to receive these, they're called Vandal drones. That's the name for these fiber optic FPVs. And so they're being utilized very extensively now, targeting Ukrainian troop deployments in a lot of houses. Of course, also the upscale apartments, really large towers being targeted in the Shakhtarsky district with these fiber optic FPVs, causing a lot of damage in preparation in lieu for some sort of urban clash that could occur later on. But even though it's not going on right now, the Russians are trying to maximize the damage. It's also a bit of a way to compensate for the lack of fab bombs that have recently been dropped. December was not a good month in terms of fab output for the Russians, and we'll talk about now some of the new explanations for why, because I talked about the sanctions and entire ordeal with Taiwan in an earlier video, but we're going to get more into that and how it's related to the Kursk offensive in a bit in the video. But let's go to the east for a second and look at some of the other updates. Russians advanced a bit in Lasivka. Here you can see geolocation. This is from grenade drops from the 2nd Battalion of the 25th Brigade, which is operating around the Lasivka region. And the Russians were able to just get an additional foothold within this village. That was a week ago now. Another really important gain on a local level was this over here. So Novohordivka mine number 3, I think it's called. Its Terracon was taken over entirely by the Russian side. And in turn, the Russians also advanced 1.5 square kilometers. The Russians here were able to secure these key trenches and run along this tree line. They were able to cut off this very important Ukrainian pocket, this pocket which was sort of bulging out and really putting a thorn in the back for the Russians located in all these villages like Mykolaiv, Krasnyar, and even the northern sections of Novohordivka. So now the Ukrainians have been pushed out of that region, and the Russians have an avenue through which to begin attacks towards Sukhyar and into this open area along the ridge of the rail line, and then actually make it into Mirnorod, because Mirnorod now is unprotected. There's nothing in between it, and the Russians are less than 2 kilometers away. As a result, the Ukrainians have moved in reinforcements, including the 5th Assault Brigade. Previously, it operated around the Chasiv Yar region, especially near the Donbass Canal region. So that's a really, really big decision by the Ukrainians to move a really experienced unit that's had a lot of time deployed in Chasiv Yar and has clearly proven itself to be a strong defensive, arbiter. It's needed in that area because it has just in-depth knowledge of the terrain and the minutia of the combat over there. But due to the gravity of the situation on Pokrovsk, it's been redeployed to here in a similar way that the 93rd Brigade was redeployed a couple of months ago. And so now they're going to work in tandem once again in this location. And, it's a big boost in terms of just manpower, because it's like at least 2,000 more men being deployed, could be even more, to help stabilize the situation. So that's very, very important to look at. And they're already starting to drop grenades onto Russian soldiers that are advancing in this location. So that occurred on January 3rd. They conducted grenade drop operations, and they're very experienced when it comes to utilizing Mavics or just drones dropping grenades. So that's going to be another bonus for the defenses over here. Also, 38th Marine Brigade, they've been operating around here for a while, but they've just recently become more active due to the need to hold on to the buffer zone between the line of contact and Mirnorod. So keep an eye out for that in the near future. Another area that has recently been activated by the Russian side is this region that is between the Toretsk River. The Toretsk River, you can see it on my cursor, and the highway that connects Kostyantynivka to Pokrovsk. So during the summer period, before the Russians had crossed over the Volkhov River and really shifted their focus away from the northern direction towards the western direction, I was very bullish on the Russian possibilities of expanding over here and eventually cutting off the ring road. And you can see now they've succeeded in doing so, at least to a certain degree. We're going to talk about the differing claims from the Russian and Ukrainian sides alike. But now you can see that after just a massive period of just static warfare, just positional fighting with very, very minuscule changes, and now the Russians have been able to retake the initiative in this area, in part due to redeployment. The 5th Upload Motor Rifle Brigade, which just took over the industrial zone in Krakow, at least in part, has been moved to this location and is already engaged in offensive activity. That included first the full capture of the village of Vozhvishenko, which we know already, and now activating these armored columns. And by the way, this unit is very good with armored columns. They did a lot of armor assaults, conducted a lot of them in the Krasnohorivka region, in Marinka, Hirivka, etc. So now they're just sort of extrapolating that experience and applying it to this area over here. And they're doing so in the direction of the highway and also Yelizavetivka. So here you can see on January 5th, that's the first instance of the Russians sort of just breaking the mold of the status quo in any sort of significant way. They crossed over the Toretsk River in a very narrow area. It may even just be entirely a ground, no stream at all. But they crossed over here, 4 Russian vehicles or 5, and they were ambushed actually by the Ukrainian side because they were able to enter into the village, and then they were immediately confronted by 2 tanks. The lead Ukrainian tank was actually destroyed during a scuffle with the Russian vehicles, and the Russian vehicles were able to promptly withdraw along this road over here backwards. And at the same time, one of the fiber optic FPVs that was deployed to support them, it ended up hitting the lead tank and destroying it. So in that engagement, the Ukrainian side did suffer damage, even though they were the ones conducting the ambush. And then on January 7th, You had once again an attempt by the Russians to infiltrate in because the Ukrainians were able to repel the initial assaults, and the Ukrainians had claimed that 6 armored fighting vehicles attacked across the Toretsk River, that 4 of them were destroyed along the way, and that only 2 of them made it to Yelizavetivka before being repelled. So now the claims are sort of ambiguous because we don't know about the status of the entirety of the village. We don't know if the Russians are just still occupying one route along these open fields towards Yelizavetivka. So that's something that is still up for questions, and we have to wait for additional geolocations. Perhaps we'll see one with the Russian flag being raised, and that would be a good indicator of actual physical presence, not just of armored vehicles during assaults, but just dismounts that are able to stay there for a longer period of time. So that's something to look for. But the loss of Yelizavetivka would be important because it's one of the only areas in this entire region that is actually populated. Everything else is just open fields. It's a perfect area for the Russian armored columns to just utilize the just vast amount of fields to expand quickly and expand deeper into the Ukrainian rear. You have no other villages besides here, Miro-Lyubivka, but that's already connected to the Toretsk River and to the perimeter of Murnerod. It's not really relevant to the section of the front line that I'm going over with my cursor. You only reach villages once you actually arrive at the T0504 highway, which is the entire point of what Russia is trying to achieve with these attacks. And that would be Malinivka, a very small village, and Mirny, which is also relatively small. So this is important to keep in mind as there are now 2 concurrent Russian attacks as well. You can see here that with Vojvychenko, it's a very important node to capture because now you have this organization point that can act as a linchpin to expand even further to the northwest. And it runs along a key highway that is only about, if we're going to measure it for you guys, 4 kilometers away from the ring road. So you could see, based on reporting from Deep State, that the Russian forces it was on the 8th of January. It was on the 9th of January, but late 8th of January, you had drone footage come out that filmed Russian vehicles crossing over the highway and making it all the way to the ring road, indicating the cutting off of physical presence between Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk along this road. And you could see how important that is because before Pokrovsk really turned into a frontline city, it acted as a massive conduit for equipment coming in from, I suppose, the entire Dnipro region, running through here and then being deployed to areas deeper in Donbass, like Chasiv Yar, for instance, or Toretsk. And so now a lot of that connectivity has been severed or has sort of been had to been circumvented in ways that may be less efficient. So all in all, it does have an effect on Ukraine logistics, just not all in one fell swoop. It's the fact that over time, the threat of losing control over that highway has forced the Ukrainians to diversify. And over time, they have had to take a hit. It just is not something that happened immediately. Here you can see that based on geolocation, the Russians have taken over 3.6 square kilometers, but Ukrainian sources claim that they've been able to push back the Russians and their armored columns ever since they were able to make it to this road. They say that there were 2 tanks and 3 infantry fighting vehicles involved with the Russian breakthrough in this location, and that 1 armored personnel carrier was destroyed by mines on the way. So then they turned back and sort of entrenched themselves west of Vojvychenko. And so there's also a possibility of this Bulge region over here being under Russian control, something that I'm just going to wait and see about. But that there's no longer a Russian presence along the ring road. So that's something that Ukrainian sources like Deep State are alleging. That can only be proven one way or another with footage, which would show that the Ukrainians reasserted their presence. But you can see here that there are Ukrainian forces from the 14th, 15th National Guard Brigades. 25th Air Assault Brigade is also generally operating around here, and the 111th Luhansk Territorial Defense Brigade has been a mainstay of this entire part of the front line for like half a year now. So they're also pretty important in this location. When it comes to Toretsk, you're going to see that there's Russian expansion west of the Kryvyi River for one of the first times, because we already knew of the very, very deep Russian infiltration into the center of Zherebets. Now they've also expanded it into Leonidivka. So the Russians here captured 1.1 square kilometers of territory. They captured large chunks of the houses on either side of the stream. And they have now approached for the first time the actual center of Leonidivka. in a way that it allows them to like establish this permanent outpost. So it's not just a transient assault that gets repelled immediately, but now the Russians have a serious stake in this location and can begin to expand outwards and take over the village in its entirety. So here you can see January 3rd, that's when the Russian armored columns initially pushed into Leonidivka, and over the past week, the fighting has been centered around this location. So it is an important Russian change to the status quo and a sort of capture over here. And in addition to consolidation around Zherebets, would have very, very deep sort of changes. It would have very deep implications for the future of Ukrainian defensive works in Novospassky and basically for the entire line running up to Kostyantynivka. So it is important for the Ukrainians to drag out the fighting and not allow the Russians to utilize this very clear pre-paved route along the rail line, along the windbreaks to push and infiltrate deep with their multitudes of armored columns of various types that continue to be deployed even after numerous assaults that were initially unsuccessful. Now they're actually beginning to reap the rewards of that, the Russian side. When it comes to Toretsk, this is an area where you don't see armored columns being utilized much due to the nature of the battlefield. It's more so urban. Now it's sort of turning into a suburban sort of battlefield because the houses are not as tightly packed. The northern or northwestern outskirts of the town are not that close together. It's actually very similar to the eastern suburbs of Toretsk when it comes to areas like Zalizhny, Pivnishny, etc. So the Russians have experience with this sort of fighting, and after just grinding tooth and nail within the center of Toretsk, any sort of background, any sort of backdrop that is less dense, less urban in nature, actually is far easier for the Russian side. And the Ukrainians in this region do have a significant reliance on drones. So whenever there's poor weather conditions, foggy weather, or precipitation, anything of that sort, and the ability of drone crews becomes weaker, that's when the Russians thrive because the Ukrainians are really banking on that in order to prolong as much as possible the Russian gains into certain neighborhoods, into certain houses. So beginning with the west over here, the Russians have been able to advance. Initially, it was utilizing a very, very narrow route along this road, Istorichno, but the thing is, the Ukrainians have displayed a lack of ability in recent months to even repel these sort of speculative assaults, these very, very deep rear penetrating assaults. And that's just due to the health and strength of the Ukrainians that is pretty much lacking. But they are able to spot those advances from the sky and drop grenades on them or conduct FPV strikes. So that inflicts casualties, but it isn't enough to change the territorial situation. And so over the past week, the Russians have solidified control and expanded to take control over this entire sort of isolated northwestern neighborhood of Toretsk. So you can see those polygons marked over here on the map. Then a bit to the north, you have this massive Russian advance, this game which occurred just east of the local Terrakhon, which for now I'm marking as under Ukrainian control. But given the way that the front line is really shaped right now, it's pretty likely that there are no longer Ukrainian forces present here due to fear of encirclement or just a lack of supply being possible. And so these regions are probably in a gray zone or could be in the process of being taken over by the Russians. But we do know for sure that the Russians have taken over this yellow polygon. This W shape sort of makes it's 0.54 square kilometers of territory. Over here, you can see that the Russians reached the outer bends, the outer bounds, I should say, of Toretsk. This is from January 7th. This is from the Predator Police Brigade. Their grenade drops hit 2 Russian soldiers reaching those northern Toretsk outskirts. And as a result, we're also very close to reaching this other Terrakhon, and there's a third one as well. So there are just a lot of localized heights that can be used to dominate the nearby battlefield. Here's just a few other videos from this region. So FPV strikes, they just hit houses in northern Toretsk that the Russians were passing through. That's a good indication of Russian presence. And then here, a Russian soldier was hit by a grenade drop in Toretsk. That was on January 7th. Here you can see on the direct northern end, not necessarily northeastern or northwestern, but the northern end, Russian soldiers, they placed a mine onto inside of one of the houses there because something that has been widely used in addition to grenade drops are actually Russians holding, or Ukrainians in some cases, taking mines, retrofitting them, giving them a new purpose, and actually using them as explosive charges against other infantry. And so that's one of the ways that in close quarters combat, either side is able to inflict significant damage and actually in some cases destroy the entire house just with one charge, which is just crazy. So here you can see that after the Russian soldier placed the mine, the FPVs hit those houses and hit the Russian soldiers that were engaged in that activity. And now the Russians are very close to this particular landfill and its adjacent mine facility. So that's very important to keep an eye out for. When it comes to the final remnants of Toretsk, because we can't say the battle is over yet, you have the final northwestern neighborhoods. You have the pocket between the two vectors of advance, which could or could not be under Russian control right now, but it includes some strategic warehouses, facilities, a local school, and the landfill. You also have this northernmost section, which is still under daily fighting, where the Russian infantry have to move in, occupy house by house, garden by garden. So that's something that's currently going on here. And with the Krimsky region, this is a location that has to be taken over by the Russians as well. It sort of feeds into an entirely different village, but it is pretty much connected to Toretsk. So it has a similar layouts to the northern outskirts. So it's another area that the Russians have to focus on, in addition to taking over the mining facility here and the local heights. All this is being done amidst the backdrop of very intense Ukrainian resistance, mainly from the air, as we said. So you have the Voron drone group of the 100th Mechanized Brigade, and within that unit, because it's become one of Ukraine's best drone units, especially in this region, they have several subdivisions. So you have the electricians drone units, and I think they have them marked over here. So it's a part of Voron of the 100th Mechanized Brigade. There's Black Hawk, and there's one other drone unit that I'm forgetting, but it's also a part of this entire assortment of UAV elements within the 100th Brigade. There's a few other troop movements that occur. So the 21st and 2nd Special Purpose Battalions, which are part of the Presidential Brigade, they were redeployed from the, say, Kharkiv Andriivka region and are now operating around here. So that's several hundred up to 1,000 men that could be moved in the scenario where the entire battalion was also relocated. So that's very important. But also the specialists in this unit, because it's one of the better units, especially some of its battalions, and they also have extensive drone history. So it will make sense to deploy them now. And they're going to be greatly needed for the hinterlands in between the northern outskirts of Toretsk, all the way to the chain of villages that it connects directly to southern Kostyantynivka. So that's something that the Ukrainians should be looking at beefing up right now, lest they had not have the ability to do so in the future. You have here the 4th Battalion of the 101st Protection Brigade. That's one of the other key units. Let's see what else here. Presidential Brigade, 32nd Mechanized Brigade no longer has a presence in this region. It's more so operating in the Pokrovsk area, but 42nd Mechanized Brigade is still around here. So that is important to keep in mind. When it comes to the Russian side, they've also had some sort of movement. So you have the 1,453rd Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment, previously operated around the Selidove region, and then also during the expansion westwards onto the southern flank of Pokrovsk. So it did play a critical role over there, but now it's being moved back and will support the activities of the 1st Motor Rifle Brigade. And there's a few other units in this location which you may recognize, like the 112th Motor Rifle Regiment. You have several PMCs, you have the Ghost Battalion, and just various assortments of units, some of them recently coming in to beef up the ranks following the Russian troop rotations that were announced and actually played out over the past week and a half, you could say. Looking at the Luhansk border, the Luhansk-Donetsk border. This is an area that's important because of the Zherebets River. The Russians have been able to cross it over and take most of Ivanivka. So there are 3 geolocations, one from January 4th. So here you have 2 of the 60th Mechanized Brigade's tanks. They fire towards Russian positions in Ivanivka, indicating a Russian presence in this location. Then here, the 144th Division, Russian division, they stormed the Ivanivka village, took over the houses. And then the next step, which we see here on January 6th, was Russian forces storming a trench south of Ivanivka, and they utilized FPVs to support them in their endeavors, targeting the Ukrainians that had held back in these regions and forcing them to retreat. So that's important to note. Looking a bit to the north, I want to zoom in and focus on Makivka. So here the Russians took over 2.4 square kilometers west of Makivka. Now they've expanded in its entirety the buffer zone around this village and have a very strong basis across the Zherebets River. They're now, if we're going to measure it for you guys, just, let's see, 3 kilometers away from Kharkivka and pretty close to the border between Luhansk and Donetsk as well. Looking a bit to the north here, you can see that the Russians have taken additional territory near Nadia. This amounts to 2.2 square kilometers of open fields, ravines, ponds, lower lying areas. And so now this is under the control of the Russian forces, as seen with the yellow polygon. An area with even more substantial Russian advances would be here just to the east of Zakhrizhov. So here in Kharkiv, you have the Russian forces getting control over 12 square kilometers of territory. Really important gain, and it occurred sort of out of nowhere when you look at it. But the Russians were able to advance 4.4 kilometers from north to south. That is really a large gain in relative terms. It also means that the Russians got most of Lozova in the process. They took over this local stronghold, which sort of runs along a ditch a bit to the north of it that starts in Novokrukhlyakivka. So now the Russians have been able to secure its possession and can begin to expand from there to cut off the pond and then to individually look at these entire sort of Oskila River villages, try to clear out the Ukrainian presence from them. And so that's something to keep in mind. But I do want to focus on Kursk today, as I said I would. And I do feel bad that it occurred while I was, very busy with school. And now this is really my only opportunity to set the record straight and establish a common understanding of the front line. So we're going to look over the Kursk situation in its entirety. So I want to begin with Makhnovka because this is an area that has seen very intense fighting between the Russian and Ukrainians alike. So to zoom in over here, Makhnovka is split. The Ukrainians control the northern portion, which leads directly into Dmitriokov and Zamoste. And again, this is all occurring very close to the Reka Suja River, just to the east of it. And you have the Russians that were able to cross over the Psal River, take Fanasievka, Cherkaska, Konopelka, and now they're making this approach northwards with the hopes of undermining Suja's southern flanks and taking it over in a manner that was totally unexpected, and in the process also eliminate Ukraine's hopes for sort of dragging out the fighting and maintaining control over the Kursk sort of pocket, or whatever you would refer to it, their Kursk holdings for an extended period of time. So that's something to keep an eye on. You have here Russian forces from the 11th Battalion of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, perhaps also 30th Motor Regiment. But more generally, they are coming up against a force consisting of the Korn Group, which is a part of the 116th Mechanized Brigade. But the actual drone operators, they're being deployed to this region, and they're providing artillery support in terms of fixing artillery strikes and doing general ISR for the rest of the Ukrainian defenders around here. There are many other units that have been deployed recently, like the 144th Infantry Brigade. And previously, I was under the assumption that it was in the Andriivka region, or the Andriivka pocket, as you could refer to it. But it's no longer there. There's no public record. Apparently, it has been moved to the Kursk region along with 61st Mechanized Brigade, although that was a while ago. So you do have a long list of units deployed to this region. And that's completely understandable because a big part of gauging the success of the offensive launched by the Ukrainians is their ability to withstand Russian assaults and hold on to key towns that are highly populated in relative terms, like Suzhou. So here are just a few other units that are currently located in this region, fighting around here and trying to repel the Russian assaults. So that's something to keep in mind. But when it comes to the total amount captured, it's 21 square kilometers. This did not happen overnight, obviously. It happened with a very long process. But now you can see that this is in the yellow, the results of those Russian expansion attacks just south of Suzhou. Let's see actually how far away it is. It's only about 3 kilometers. So, that is within striking distance. Now, here to the north, this is where we get to the interesting parts. So we're going to begin by looking at the Ukrainian attacks, and then we'll shift focus to the Russian attacks that have continued up until this day. We're going to look first at this eastern direction towards Berdin and the village of Novosonnitsky. I think that's how you pronounce it, but I just can't see the entire name. So around 9 a.m., that's when it started, 9 a.m. of January 5th. That's when you received the first reports of Ukrainian armored assaults that broke through the line of contact, which really was separated by a large amount of gray zone, which is understandable because the area separating Cherkasskoye Preshnoy, for instance, from Berdin is largely just open fields and a couple of ditches. So that area was very quickly taken over by the Ukrainian side throughout the day of January 5th. And they advanced along a very particular route. This would be the Ukrainian side, for instance, and they advanced like this all the way into southern Berdin and then made their way a bit to the east into Novosonitsky. And that was the furthest extent of Ukrainian advances. There was not anything that penetrated further. So the Ukrainians were unable to reach even Bolshoi Soldatskoye, let alone take it over. Bolshoi Soldatskoye remained throughout the entirety of the Ukrainian assault and to this day remains an integral part of Russia's frontline activities, and it acts as an organization point and linchpin for future assaults. So when it comes to Berdin and Novosibirsk, over the 5th and the 6th of January, there were difficult battles around here, but eventually the Russians were able to reorganize, regroup, and push them out of most of those locations. And you could say that there's probably ambiguity about what's going on in Berdin right now, and that some of it is still in the gray zone. But you can say that for the most part, neither one of those villages was taken over by the Ukrainian side, even at any point in time, even during the initial stages of the assault. And now the Russians are just working on picking up the pieces and clearing it out. So when it comes to the Russian garrison over here, it is eclectic. You have 136th Motor Rifle Brigade, but they did not play a big role in the defense here. 488th Motor Rifle Regiment, they're involved. 26th Tank Regiment, they played a massive role in the initial repulsion and counterattacks. You have the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, they had some of their elements deployed to this region, or not 30th Brigade, but 30th Regiment. The 204th Special Purpose Akhmat Regiment was also deployed here, and some of their units were heavily involved in the drone attacks, in the artillery fixing, in the actual targeting of armored vehicles. There's a few other Akhmat regiments that were deployed around here, along with the National Guard, Rosgvardia, and Spetsnaz units. I want to see what else is here. So the second Spetsnaz Brigade, they were also critical parts of this defensive efforts. So they were all deployed around here. But the Ukrainians probably chose this axis for the attack for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Ukrainians probably, in an ideal scenario, would like to get control over a moderately sized, large-sized village within Kursk, because right now the only one they have is Suja, and the closest competitor would be Bolshoi Soldatskoye, which is not massive, but maybe it's like equivalent or a bit more than the Malaya Luknaya settlement that is currently under their control. So that would be a good region to sort of take control over, hold on to, and then maybe in the future even utilize again to expand even deeper into Russian territory. That would be an ideal hope for the Ukrainians. And Bolshoi Soldatskoye, just in an ideal scenario, when you're looking at a deep advance, it is about 7 kilometers away, which wouldn't be that far-fetched when it comes to the sort of advances that we saw by the Ukrainians during August and the initial offensive into Kursk. But so much has changed since then when it comes to the Russian preparedness and to the dynamics on the ground that even that was not possible. Even reaching that was not possible, let alone the first line of villages before reaching that said village of Bolshoi Soldatskoye. So, of course, that fell on its face. But there's a few other reasons for that. It could be just that there is a lack of Russian troop density over here. When you compare the Russian sort of manpower composition in this region, this sort of maybe 15-kilometer wide region of the front line, in comparison to areas a bit to the northwest, like Pogrebki or around the Koronova region. You zoom in, you could see that it's like the western flank of Malaya Luknaya. It's very dense when it comes to Russian soldiers. There's just a massive quantity of them, and it extends all the way southwards to this region, running along these ponds and along what we would call the Rekas Nagost River. And even you could say the same thing about the region in southern Kursk, the area south of Suja. That area also does have a pretty sizable amount of Russian forces, and the Ukrainian offensive with armored vehicles is more complicated over here due to all the tributaries and the rivers and the swamps and just horrible conditions for fast-paced attacks. So that's another area that could be ruled out. So really, I would have to be somewhere between, I would say, Pogrebki or Kamishevka all the way to, say, Ruskaya Konopelka, which would be, I suppose, a 35-kilometer ring of territory or just a ring of perimeter that could be attacked theoretically by the Russian side or by the Ukrainian side. So the Ukrainians in this case, they were probably trying to take advantage of a lack of heavy equipment, a lack of extensive drone activity, lack of extensive air sorties in this one particular region. So an area that's sort of is chronically under not under enough attention, you would say, and trying to take advantage of that to extend the amount of holdings they have over here and use that as a linchpin or at least as an area that they can dig in for in the future. That would be just the rationale behind it, but it will not be anything more than that. It will not be anything to significantly change the course of the battle over here, because that would require much more planning. It will require much more scale when it comes to the sort of operations than what we actually saw on January 5th. And perhaps there's a potential of the Ukrainians are and were and still are preparing for such large scale offensive activities, but that they were thwarted and they were unable to implement that on January 5th due to the factors that we're going to describe soon. But when it comes to the actual units involved, it was the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, the 80th Air Assault Brigade, and also the 8th Special Purpose Regiment. Those would be the main ones involved. Some also said that the 47th Brigade was involved along with the 36th and Marine Brigade, but I think that they have more of a pronounced presence a bit to the west and they were involved in defensive activities. So I'm just going to be cautious of that. When it comes to the actual advances by the Ukrainians, at the end, you could say maximum 10.5 square kilometers, mainly open fields, not even a single house. The Ukrainians, in the initial phases of the attack, they utilized very extensive electronic warfare jamming, and a lot of it came from Western training or Western jamming systems. And that was supposed to have some sort of massive effect on Russian communications. And given the scale of the attempted jamming, that would imply that the Ukrainians were hoping for a much larger offensive than what actually came into fruition, which could speak to a larger failure when it comes to the attacking planning. So the reality is, first of all, even in cases where jamming was effective, fiber optic FPVs were utilized instead, and those really are not affected by that. They're not really affected by the radio signals and the jamming of them, and so they were able to operate freely. Hundreds of these fiber optic or Vandal FPVs being utilized on a daily basis, targeting dozens of Ukrainian targets, moving and not moving on a daily basis. That is what occurred during the Ukrainian offensive activities, and that led to numerous Ukrainian vehicles. And now this is where we list them out: BTR-4s, you could say Challenger 2s. There's an example of that. There's a few others like the Kozak 7, the Strikers. You had engineering vehicles, IMRs. We're going to click on some of the actual examples, like the engineering vehicle built off of the Leopard 1. There's a bunch of examples, but all of them were seen and targeted by the Russian side. Plenty of tanks as well targeted by those fiber optic FPVs. A lot of ISR drones were not targeted, even though they were up in the skies, and in cases, some of them were in very high altitude, but they were still not targeted by the jamming, or they were not completely destroyed. You had situations where regular FPVs were utilized, not actual fiber optics, and they were still able to hit their targets. But right before they made it to the vehicle, that's when the signals began to get jammed, and that's when they started to see some sort of issues with their connection and begin to crash out, and the signal, along with the actual first-person view, began to cut off. But that is, of course, expected when you're deploying such an enormous amount of electronic warfare systems and volume to sort of interfere with the frequencies. So that was expected, but the Russian drone operators tried to sort of circumvent that by directly flying their drones above them. So they would fly it right above them. So it would be sort of like running along the same plane vertical wise. And that was a way to just sort of reduce the amount of jamming that those drones experience. So the Russians had plenty of ways to improvise, and they were able to continue with one of the most effective ways of breaking off an armored assault, which would be through drones individually picking off vehicles, as the Ukrainians know very well from their own efforts to break down Russian assaults. So regardless of that fact, you also had the Russian Air Force very active, because the day of the assault, January 5th, was actually a day with clear skies. There were no clouds in Kursk for the first time in 3 months. It was actually a perfect day for Russian Air Force to get an idea of what was going on, and for drones to collect intelligence on the Ukrainian side. And so the Ukrainians did not launch it at a time when the weather was more foggy and could have been a hindrance for the Russian side in their observations. So that was good for the Russians, you could say. When it comes to UMPKs, they were not really used on the first day. You didn't really use that many fabs on the first day. just due to sometimes jamming of the navigation system, but also due to just the lack of preparedness at the initial moments of the assault. Also, because launching fabs at moving targets isn't usually something that ends up working. Usually, they target larger static positions that are closer to the rear. So by January 6th, that's when you began to see compilations of fabs being utilized, and they targeted apparently a small mobile air defense system in Suja. So that's just one example, but there are countless of them now. The Russians actually, throughout the entirety of like the past month, have been striking deployment points in Sumy, indicating that there was at least a certain level of understanding that the Ukrainians were working on an assault operation, and they probably haven't stopped yet. It's not going to be the last Ukrainian assault on, I suppose, a battalion or company level. I'm firmly in the camp that believes that, and Russian sources have also said something to this similar. Ever since December 31st, Russian channels have been warning of Ukrainian attacks coming from this region, but also coming into the south from the area between the border of Kursk and Belgorod, which would be further south and not really related to what we just saw. And so that's something to keep in mind for the future if that ends up coming into fruition. It's just something that the Russians have had a hunch about in their mentioning. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. But when it comes to what's actually going on right now, really the attacks have fizzled out. The Ukrainians are just working on holding on to whatever they have maintained, which would be those 10 square kilometers. And the Russians are really focusing most of their attacks on the western flank of Malaya Loknaya. And you could see that the Russians here have a lot of footage indicating the vehicular damage caused to the Ukrainian side. We're going to click on some of it so you guys can see. Not this one. This is not necessarily relevant, but here, let's begin. And I'm going to click through it for you guys. Here's just a Russian drone picturing a 7-vehicle column advancing to Berdin. This is an FPV strike onto forested areas. Here, this is a Vandal FPV. It hit a tank, it hit a Striker, it hit a Descent 1. That's an engineering vehicle that is attached to each individual mechanized company. And then here you have, again, Vandal drone strike on a Bergen Panzer armored recovery vehicle. Another vehicular loss. The Russians that were still left in Novosonsky, they encountered Ukrainians and within their armored columns that were able to make it into the populated areas, into these houses, and that's where a clash occurred on January 6th. So then after the battle, the Russian side, including the 204th Regiment, they filmed the destroyed Ukrainian MRAP. They also filmed several Ukrainian KIA. I think there was like 7 in total that I saw. And they took 13 Ukrainians POW from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. There's a few other geolocations here. This is from a Russian FPV strike onto Ukrainian armored vehicle in this village. And then here to the east, you can see that the Russians initially, while the Ukrainians were still advancing, they utilized AGS-30 automatic grenade launcher fire towards those advancing Ukrainians located 2 kilometers to the west. So that's just a synopsis of what's been going on over there. The Ukrainians also, interestingly, did not use mobile mortars during their offensive activity over here, so did not have as much friendly fire support in close quarters throughout the entire course of the fighting. And also, even though initially the talk was really exaggerated about the scale of the attacks, over time it became clear that either it was the plan all along, or the Ukrainians revised their plans to make it so the attack was 2 or 3 companies. That was what was reported by some Ukrainian sources, or up to a battalion in size. So 2 or 3 companies would imply that it was like 400 or 600 men. If it was a full battalion, then it would be about 1,000 men. But when you're looking at the numbers that were mentioned in cases like around Berdin, the initial infiltration towards this forested region was 70 men, and some of the attacks towards like Berdin were 30 men. So you're looking at pretty small numbers in comparison, and it's very focused on one specific area. But even then, it was not successful in the objective of achieving anything significant when it comes to capturing territory or holding on to key locations along highways or along tree lines. Just all in all. And it could just be that the Ukrainians ended up calling off any future deployment for the near future due to those initial failures. At the same time, though, the Russians that they saw the Ukrainians launching the attacks on the 9th of or the 5th of January at 9 a.m., they also launched their own attacks around the same period of time in the morning of January 5th in an area that is like 15 kilometers to the west. So to zoom in over here, the Russians launched very significant attacks, mainly from the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, the 115th Marine Brigade and the 106th VDV Division. I think those are the units. They launched attacks that you can see here with geolocations. The Ukrainian defenders, they consist of the 6th and 4th Ranger Regiments, the 22nd Mechanized Brigade, the 92nd Assault Brigade, the 95th Air Assault Brigade, the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, and a few other units that are pretty notable around here. So it consists of a very strong defensive core along with the 47th, and they were able to endure this Russian assault. I think it amounted to like over 94 assaults in a single day by the Russian side, which is just insane. And it was a massive distraction and changed a lot of the focus away from the Ukrainian offensive to defending against the Russian offensive that was very close to cutting off the entirety of the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk and Malaya Loknaya off entirely. And so that became the number one priority to ensure defensive cohesiveness over here. And that also played a role in why the Ukrainian offensive did not work out in the way that they may have hoped. You can see here in yellow, these are areas taken over by the Russians during this attack. And here you can see it's 1.4 square kilometers. Here it's 1 square kilometer in total. This is from January 5th. It's the Russian armored assault, which was repelled to a certain degree by the 47th Brigade. You can see that it was a massive armored column that advanced southwards, was able to make it to this local stronghold, and it's currently unconclusive whether the Russians were fully repelled or if they dismounted infantry that are now located for now a couple of days in this location, in this trench just to the east of Alexandria. So that's something that we have to wait and see about. But definitely the Russians were able to at least approach this location before encountering fierce resistance from the Ukrainian 47th Brigade. A bit to the north, the Russian forces were able to make it to Nikolaevka. They advanced through open fields and through the very thick tree lines, thick shrubbery. Here they were able to take nearly 5 square kilometers. They approached Staraya Storichno, and also you could see that they were able to get a foothold in Nikolaevka before being pushed back out by the 1st Mechanized Battalion of the 22nd Brigade. So here you can see that in this geolocation, the 22nd, 95th, and 17th Brigades, they all played a role in that recapturing process on January 9th. They claimed that they were able to inflict casualties onto North Korean soldiers that were involved as well, but you can't see any conclusive proof of that in the video. But definitely now the Ukrainians have been able to stabilize the line to a certain degree. In this case, the 95th Brigade actually hit over 20 Russian soldiers with FPVs that were trying to break through and enter in and take over the entire village. So now it is true that the Ukrainians have a very solid line running along this entire road, connecting all the villages together, but there's no more depth when it comes to the defense. It's like, look at it. It's 3 kilometers in width, this corridor. And so even though it has defensive gumption, it doesn't have a lot of territory to trade for the Ukrainian side. A lot of the territory that was sort of used by the Ukrainians as a comfort zone, as a gray zone, as insurance between the Russians and where the Ukrainians are currently in their core defending, has been seized by the Russians during the past 5 days of offensive activities. So even if the Russians did not take over populated areas, it took off the one area that served as a breathing space for the Ukrainians. So now it's going to become more and more difficult over an extended period of time for the Ukrainians to maintain control in these regions. So the hope would be for the Ukrainians to conduct localized counterattacks and just push back the Russians slightly, chip away at their gains in these regions in order to restore a sense of normalcy for the Ukrainian garrison that is near Staraya Storichno and Nikolaevka and more generally Pokrovsk. So that's something to keep in mind for the coming days. The Russian assault was massive on the 5th of January, utilizing over 40 armored vehicles, according to the Ukrainian side. And now is the period where a lot of the footage is beginning to get released, but not all of it. And according to the Ukrainian side, there have been more than 50 Russian attacks launched on a daily basis in these regions on average in the Kursk area. So that is just extremely massive and really does shift the focus away from any proactive Ukrainian measures that could have been taken. So now they're really focusing on the defensive aspect of holding on in these locations. So that is all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.